Boneless. Let's get straight into that. Anno Domini 1421. Times have been hard, but perhaps the new year will bring better fortunes. Frode assured his friend Thorsten, and to a large degree himself, as they left the church in Hvalsey. The trade in walrus ivory had dropped off to an almost nil, but we still have plenty of seals to eat. Harder to get grain shipments without the ivory trade, but we may survive yet, if we don't lose everyone fleeing to Iceland or Scandinavia. And Thorsten nodded, and he was soon to be married to a local girl of finer quality than most. Sigrid beyond the tier. He worried for their homeland and for their future. I'm not so sure that we can continue in this land with so little trade. We don't want to have to live like the Skrælings. They keep moving closer each year, invading the lands we settled in that our folk developed. Almost every man and youth of age is coming on to the next hunt. You are right, we won't starve. The salt water stung Thorsten's eyes, yet he still managed to peer ahead as the small fleet set out in search for the harp seals that would ensure their town had food. And he feared the dark, bruised-looking sky that loomed to the south or the southwest would bring foul weather, and that would spoil the hunt and postpone the harvest of meat and what little produce they could eke from the land. The wind had freshened, a warm wind for these latitudes, but anything that made the surface of the sea churn was unwelcome in his reckoning. And he was jarred from his task when the boat rocked as though it had hit something. There was no grating, as with rocks, but the object had been hard. Perhaps a log from a far-off land, carried by a current. He thought hopefully. Wood, even sea-soaked, is always useful and valuable. He scanned the area around the rails but saw nothing at first, and then a long, pale object that slid beneath the keel, perhaps some odd whale or perhaps a shark, he wondered. And then the object grew as it rose from the frigid depths. He could make out swells of movement as the pallid creature twisted upwards towards the craft and the 20 men aboard. It took his senses some time to register that this was only part of the vast creature, a being of legend, a single tentacle of the Kraken. He crossed himself and prayed to his god, who had been so strange to his ancestors, to banish the eldritch demonic creature. At last he regained enough sense to cry out to the others, "Prepare for a strike from below!" The tentacle did not merely strike the vessel. It bashed into the keel and split the steady beam that had travelled so far and served so well. The ghastly appendage continued to rise as it broke through the deck and writhed in the air above the waves. The men reacted with screams, prayers, or silence, each to his individual want. A few who were close to it dove for the sides, and a few more picked up oars or pulled out knives to attack the limb, their actions speaking to the blood of the descendants of the old Viking, Hvalsey, who had founded their colony. Thorsten felt the boat heaving and splintering all at once. He aimed himself towards the shoreline that was almost beyond sight and dove, and he swam as hard as he could towards the next craft that bobbed nearby, and from exclamations of consternation emanated over the now heavily churning waves. The crew shouted in terror at what they saw, and then to encourage Thorsten. Thorsten watched in horror as another tentacle rose and wrapped itself around the bow of the boat, crewmen and all, their shouts turned into screams of agony. The tentacle squeezed until the shattered remnants of the boat and bodies burst forth in every direction, and he continued to swim as best he could in the turbulent sea. He had a goal. The aft section of the boat had remained mostly intact and now bobbed away from the shallow loop of flesh which slowly sank once more below the waves. He felt the current of its passage drag at him and attempt to pull him in its wake to the cold depths below. Eventually, he was able to catch up to the broken but still floating section of the boat. He crawled up onto it. His oiled, seaskin furs had kept out more of the water than he could ever had hoped for. and he still heard screams coming from everywhere. It was a hunting craft. The noises from dying men and boys, his friends, most of the healthy adult male population of his town, reached him over the strengthening wind that blew him in the right direction of his makeshift raft. He was able to clutch to another piece of flotsam, a portion of plank from yet another shattered craft, and use it as a makeshift paddle. Without wind and the inrushing tide, he might never have made it to shore. When he drew near to land, he could hear the crashing of the waves on the rocks, a sound dreaded by sailors. He paddled as hard as he could, but did almost no good. He was all but frozen, despite his furs and oil skins. He feared that his fingers and face would be frostbitten, even if he should reach land alive. He prayed almost constantly. He even suddenly offered a prayer to the old sea god, Jord, and to his own namesake, Thor, who now raged in his anger against the Jotunnar, the giants of legend, and made the clouds roil and flash with lightning from his hammer, Mjolnir. He hoped these were the right deities, and he spared an apology to the Christos for blasphemy. He only wanted to ensure that he survived, that he was there for his Sigrid and their life they had planned. And one of the gods, or more, seemingly answered his prayers in the most favourable manner, and he was washed over the jagged, jutting surface and deposited onto the shore with smaller rocks, more broken than the others. Now he was bruised and battered, but not broken. Now, if he could find shelter, he had a chance to survive. Inshore, the rocks grew larger and the land rose precipitously. He believed that he'd been blown east of the settlement. He knew these shores to be rocky and forbidden, but no more than a few miles from home. He shivered with cold and tucked his midden-covered hands under his arms. He tucked his face into each of his upper arms in turn and scraped away the layer of ice that had formed in his hair and beard. He scanned the rocks that had become a rock face, and there, a crack in the surface, his mind crowned in triumph. He was soon ensconced in a fissure that let light in from above, yet it was enclosed and secure from the blustering wind outside. Still, he shivered. He simply could not get warm. The wetness had in the end breached even the oil-sealed hide. He checked his pouch and found that he still had his fire starter kit. It was mostly dry. He made his way to the edge of the water where the waves had deposited his makeshift raft. He kicked off a few pieces of the boat and used them to pry apart the rest of the raft, and then carried a portion of them back to his intended camping space. After a few more trips back and forth, he was warm enough to pay attention and cold enough to concentrate diligently on getting the fire started with the ice-rimmed pieces. The skill of lighting wet fuel was well known to the shore dweller in the northern clime, and he was soon accompanied by a merry glow of orange and yellow, and the warmth of one of humanity's oldest allies, fire. There was a goodly amount of smoke from the dampness in the woods, but the opening above made for a decent enough chimney. He arrayed the remaining pieces around the fire to let them dry. He had no more kindling and no more fuel for his sparks, and so he had to maintain this blaze if he wanted to live. Now he was still freezing and incredibly hungry, yet his discomforts reminded him that he was alive. Perhaps the only member of the hunting party to survive. So many of the men and older boys gone. Surely the thing had been a demon, some conjuring from the past. He heard odd sounds coming from the back of the opening in the rock face, back where the ground above closed in on itself and the narrow view of the sky disappeared to be replaced by the pure, Aruban darkness that it found only under the ground. At first, there was dead silence, so profound that he could hear only the dim ringing that some experience when there is no noise. Then there was a hint of scraping, slither. The noise made a chittling as it slid over the rock. Whatever insect wore this suit of armor, it was large. At least as large as himself, chittering squeaks erupted from every direction, and he caught glints of light on hard gleaming surfaces. Black eyes, numerous spiky legs, and waving claws. He coughed and awakened to a nearly extinguished fire. He spent the next several minutes saving the coals and nursing them back to flames. At last he had the fire going again and chanced piling a stick or two onto it. The wood smoked and hissed in protest at the change of the basic elements applied to it, but eventually settled into a quietly popping conflagration. His eyes drooped once more, and he dozed to sounds of a chittering horde, a nightmare of crawling, slithering, twitching insects, sliding through rough plates and scales against one another, and the surrounding rocks to create a clacking, crawling mass that would have given him chills even without the cold. "Thorsten, you're alive!" He shivered and shuddered, longing to crawl into the turf fire he could feel crackling nearby. He was now wrapped in dry woolen blankets, and though the cold still racked his body, he checked and felt that his appendages were numb and sore but still had some sensation. Perhaps he had avoided frostbite after all. He croaked up to the person who had spoken to him, his voice low and dry. "How?" Frode looked down on him from beside his sleeping mat. "We had to wait for the storm to pass. We found wreckage and 2 bodies washed ashore east of Hvalsey. A few others made it to shore using wreckage to float themselves. We searched along the beach until the rocks got big. And we were getting ready to turn back when old Arnie, the eagle-eyed, spied smoke rising above the cliff. It took a while to reach you. Your fire was all but gone and you had piled the last of your wood upon it. We could not wake you. It seemed you were in a trance. It was even harder to carry you back to the settlement. If you're asking, how long? The answer is 4 days since the boats were all taken under. You missed the wailing all of the new-made widows, and the keening of the mothers who lost so many young sons. I am glad now that I was chosen to stay behind. Now, you must answer some questions. What happened, my friend?" He supplied a cup of warm liquid to comfort the abused man. Thorsten stared into the middle distance. He tried to recall, to place himself once more in that terrifying place. In that ridiculously small craft that the kraken tore through like it was made from soft leaves. You won't believe me," he whispered in his now hoarse voice. "It was the kraken." He said the last quickly, trying to spit it forth so that even the word would be expelled from his mind, but he could not deny it even to himself. He shifted his eyes to meet those of his friend. "Frode, it was a monster from the old stories. We've seen big things that sometimes wash up on shore. The soft and many-armed creatures from deep waters. This thing dwarfed any living creature. It was so large that it burst through the keel and shattered a boat instantly. Another tentacle wrapped around the boat. I swam towards and cut it in half. The men and boys, they screamed and cried. Some choked and others, they were crushed. The rest likely ended up in the sea, where it was full of chop and so cold." He trailed off as his body racked with a shudder, and he began to cough. Once again he settled. He found that his voice, already hoarse, was almost gone. He beckoned Frode to come closer. "What happened with the giant insects? From the crevasse where I hid. Did you see them?" Frode leaned back, concern on his face for his wounded friend. "Thorsten, you must have had hallucinations. You suddenly have a fever. We found no insects, giant-sized or otherwise. The crevasse appeared to be clear of anything but sand. It smelled rank, but it's so close to the sea. Nothing unusual. However, it did appear to go back for a long way. Maybe you heard wind scraping over the rocks and sand." Thorsten gave a brief nod as he faded once more into a healing sleep. When he awakened again, he felt slightly better, though still dry and thirsty. Soft hands held a cup to his mouth and he drank greedily. A sweet voice soothed him. "Easy, Thorsten. You will have all you want, but take it slowly." "Sigrid, my love," he thought as he forced his eyes to open past the gum and discomfort. And there she was in all of her glory and beauty. How was such a wretch as he so blessed? Well, he was glad of the thought as it brought tears to his eyes and provided at least a small comfort to them. He managed a hoarse whisper that to him sounded better than when he had spoken to Frode. "Sigrid, my Sigrid, I lived through it for you." And Sigrid smiled down at him. "I am so thankful that you did, my Thorsten. The widow's life is not for me. Besides, you haven't married me properly, just yet. Now, when you've had enough to drink, we'll try some broth." Over the next few days, Thorsten quickly regained his vitality. Yet, he found that he tended to sleep for longer than usual. His nightmares were stocked with chitters and scrapes and odd stenches. Still, he had to get back to work. So many had been killed by the Kraken, that of old men, the younger boys, and many of the women now had to hunt to keep the survivors of the settlement fed. As the days came and went, he knew with ever-increasing certainty that the colony were able to fail. They would not give up, not all at once, but already ships packed with settlers had begun to leave for Iceland, some to stay and others to continue on back to Scandinavia. In any case, none will return to Grönland. The land will be left to the seals, the walruses, and the Skraelings. With all that there was to do, he still managed to escape late one afternoon and make his way back to the crevasse, the crack in the rock wall that had preserved his life. He brought a pair of torches and armed himself with a belt axe and long knife. The nightmares ensured that even when he stayed abed for longer hours, he did not truly rest. He found that he could never truly keep warm as he was plagued with shivers when he recalled the sounds of the living nightmare that emanated from the depths. Whether from the Christian hell or near him of the sagas, he had no idea. But surely it was a terrible place to belch forth creatures that could produce such hideous noises. He needed to know what was lurking in the darkness. He found the place easily enough. There was nothing unusual on the outside, no evidence that he had even visited the place. Inside he found the charred remnants of his desperate fire, a black stain on the sandy floor. He was unable to use the weak light that filtered in from above for a while as he journeyed into the gloom that grew ever deeper until he had to stop and strike his fire starter to one of the torches. He planned to go for as long as the first torch lasted, or the crevasse closed in too tightly. He would have the second torch for the return journey. Well, there was no guarantee that it would last the same amount of time, but he was confident that he would find the answers he sought. The walls remained a double arm's width apart, almost uniformly, as if the passage through the solid rock of earth had been cut with an enormous sword. Perhaps deliberately wrought by some elder race, perhaps the dwarves or the kobolds. And he chuckled. I have to stop letting my imagination run wild. Next I'll be seeing shadows of monsters. The narrow clefts above had apparently closed completely, or night had fallen early. The shadows indeed lengthened. He heard a noise up ahead. Scraping? He asked himself. Perhaps running water from the ice cap has cut, or is cut in a new stream. As he drew closer to the source of the sound, it stilled. The path took a steep turn downwards, and he realized that he had been on a gentle slope in that direction ever since he'd left behind the crack above, with its friendly natural light. He shivered, though the air was not uncomfortably cold, and he was warmly attired. The floor leveled again, and After a short decline, and once more he heard noises, skittering like the feet of a gigantic spider, the snapping of pincers, and the rustling clatter of chitinous plates. The sounds from his nightmares. He nearly walked off a precipice in his fear of the loathsome reverberations. The way ahead opened suddenly, and far below he caught the glint of water. A wet armor, as masses of enormous arthropods crawled over one another in a mat that rested on and just below the surface of the shallows. The body of water stretched far into the distance, and the roof above soared into the shadows. There was a narrow pathway that branched to the right and followed the walls downward to the water's edge, maybe 40 feet below, where he could see the writhing mass and smell their horrid odor. There was a hint of blackishness to the water, perhaps some access to the sea, some deep cavern that connected the bodies of salt water. He saw that his first torch now guttered and provided only a little light, and so he lit the second torch and tossed the first over the cliff and down onto the creatures below. It landed onto the broad back of something that resembled a scorpion, though Thorsten, who had never seen a scorpion, could not have said so. To him, it appeared to be some form of demon. In the brief time before the creature attempted to flee from the flames, the heat from which finally penetrated its hard casing, Thorsten saw that the monstrous form was surrounded by equally hideous forms in many shapes and sizes. Things that were like insects but inflated to lengths and breadths that ranged from rat-sized to the size of a large man. They clattered and crawled, some struggled with others, some dined on corpses of their fellows or drained fluids from their living bodies. Others seemed to flee hither and thither. The burned creature scuttled forward until it found water deep enough to submerge itself, and the torchlight from below was eternally snuffed. Thorsten looked around at the cavern in the fresh light of the second torch. He saw that the roof was not as high as he'd first imagined, yet it was covered in a strange substance, and it moved. He saw figures scuttle. Spiders! They were the size of house cats. He fled back up the pathway, back towards light and life. He had seen enough, and never again wanted to look on such sights, hear such sounds, or smell such odors. I tell you, Frode, my nightmares are real. I don't know why, and the others saw nothing, but that crevasse leads to a cavern. There is water at the bottom, sea water. It is full of gigantic insect things. Thorsten had been tired by the time he returned, and it was already the dark of night. He had run as fast as he could, and then stumbled for a while, and had run some more. Now he sought the counsel of his best friend, and the wisest man he knew. Frode looked at him sullenly, considering. Thorsten, you are a good man, sturdy, strong and smart. Let's say you found the gigantic insect things. I believe you. I know that you are reasonable. What of it? Before Thorsten could object, he continued. Even if they left the cavern, where would they go? What would they do? They are large, yes, but pose no threat. The spiders, maybe, but they have not travelled above ground so far as we know. You are wrapped up because of your trauma at seeing the other men die, in whatever way that they did. You survived, and perhaps you feel some guilt, perhaps the source of your night terrors. Thorsten considered for a moment. He had gone to Frode for the very purpose of seeking wisdom, as Odin had sought wisdom in the saga. The All-Father had paid a terrible price with the loss of his eye and the visions of Ragnarok. His doom and that of most of his children, and the destruction of all of the worlds of Yggdrasil, and he shuddered. I do not want wisdom at such a price, and if Father Nud could hear my musings, he might have my eye burned from the socket for blasphemy. Maybe Frode is right. Nothing to fear from the creatures caught in their deep cavern. I see, Frode. I understand and would try to rest now that I know that I did not imagine the creatures. There is some little comfort in the thought that it wasn't entirely in my mind. He nodded. Indeed, there is an even more comforting thought. Sigrid, we will have our wedding soon. By the time he left Frode's home, he was smiling, visions of his sweetheart filling his head and his heart and replacing those of a pit full of horrors or the writhing tentacles of a legendary monster. As the days went by before the wedding, his nightmares decreased in number and intensity. Oversized or not, the creatures were just insects. Even though they appeared like demons, surely they were simply some oddities of nature. Thorsten assuring himself of these truths each waking moment. The wedding and the honeymoon that followed were true bliss for him. He and Sigrid settled into a routine, and while he never quite forgot the monsters that lurked in the deep, he no longer dwelt on them. At least until the Kraken sank another ship. This time, it was a large vessel, bound for Iceland, and with fleeing colonists who sought food and a more bountiful life than they had on Grönland. Many of those aboard were women and small children. Their screams echoed across the water as the slimy tentacles rose to wrap oily coils around the vessel, suckers planting on every surface they touched to include living flesh. Then the craft began to splinter and burst in a foul embrace of the Leviathan of the deep. The ship sprang leaks and started to break when the body of the behemoth bobbed into sight for just a moment. The hideous eye and beak peeked above the surface for just a moment, and then it was gone. The bulk of the ship with it. Colourful blobs danced on the waves, clothing and other objects that the pilgrims had taken with them, along with a few swimmers. He and several others noticed at the same time and called out to those nearby to take boats and rescue the survivors. Most of those on the docks were terrified. Many had fled, and Thorsten found himself in a boat with an elderly man who lacked a right hand, and a middle-aged woman with a careworn face, one of the widows of his first encounter with the Kraken. They managed to get one of the smaller rowboats out onto the water, and soon they fished out any floating object that appeared to be a survivor. They brought home 5 in total. The rest were already dead from the attack or drowned in the aftermath. The entire time, Thorsten rowed and directed the others. Now on the way back, he could think only of the creature rising once more and sending one of its tentacles to crush him and all of the others, to grip their bodies and gulp them into its terrible maw with a savage beak. The thing met and included all of the remaining adults in the community. There were not many. Frode led the discussion. It is clear that we cannot stay. We will starve, despite the meat we catch, nor can we leave. It is not safe to enter the water. Those in the ship claim to be the last of the settlers in the western colonies, but there may be more survivors. Perhaps we should form an expedition and seek out our brethren and secure them if we may. Maybe with a combined effort, we can escape this land that has become accursed. Thorsten raised an immediate objection. Even if any are still there and have ships and any space to spare, they will have to sail past this part of the land, directly into the horror that lurks just off of our shore. And there were some intense exchanges as the fears of each person raised their tempers, and angry shouts and accusations soon flew. The community was on the verge of disintegration by the time some semblance of order was restored. Frode, voice still raised, did what he did best. He reasoned. So, we send a small party to the west and another to the east to see if the Kraken has ravished the Skraelings or any of our kin who ventured out to live on their own. I will go west and Thorsten will lead a party eastward. If we do not return inside a month, You must do what you think is best. But I recommend that you take a ship and flee in the night. So far, the Kraken has attacked in the mornings. Perhaps in the late afternoon or evening, it will be at rest." The thing broke up after general agreement, and the parties prepared to depart at first light. Frode set out with his small group and headed along the coast to visit the western outposts. He'd never made the journey on foot. He never had to. They'd always made it by watercraft. They made with no serious mishaps or challenges. But the journey overland, it was long. They pressed inland to cut down on the miles. They drew near to the eternal ice cap that covered the bulk of the land mass. They travelled closer until they could spy the gleaming white sheet off to the north. Wondrous and bleak all at once, Frode pronounced positive mutters when they halted for a brief rest. The ice cap had kept them from settling further inland. They'd heard that some Skraelings lived on it, nomads who chased game and lived a very primitive lifestyle, but it was not a place for civilized people. 10 days from when they left, they reached the largest settlement. It was utterly empty. The buildings were closed. No smoke rose to greet the late afternoon sun. Even the church, it was abandoned. The candles and candle holders all gone. They found nothing edible, even when they scoured all buildings. There was nothing of use and no ships or boats berthed in the docks. It was truly a ghost town. They settled in for the night and decided to use the church as a camping spot to rest for a day and then return. In the darkness before dawn, Frode awakened to whispers and the scuffing of feet outside the front doors. He'd set a watch, just in case, and had taken the last shift. He listened carefully. He could almost make out the words in harsh whispers. "Know who are maybe Skraelings." He could not hear all the whispered words, yet he understood the language. "Hello, we are friends from the east," he called through the door. Shortly, the two groups greeted one another. The last 3 members of the colony were thralls, 2 of their own people and a Skraeling woman. "No master, they all left, didn't take us. No room on the ships and not enough food. We tried to make a place with the Skraelings, but they wouldn't take us, not even her." He jerked a thumb towards the ugly, little browbeaten woman who never raised her head nor her eyes. "Best we could tell, she wasn't from their tribe, or they didn't like that she'd been with the white skins. Maybe you'd let us go with you? There's nobody left here of our folk. We was thinking of heading your ways anyhow." Thorsten missed his new wife. He was loath to be separated from her. Sigrid Bjorn-Dottir was far better than any woman remaining in this god-forsaken land, Grunland. He and his little band had already crossed over land and had already passed over the closed ground above the crevasse and its cavern full of terrifying creatures. His nerves had remained taut the entire time as they walked over the place where in his imaginings lived the mass of monstrosities far below the ground. The land ascended and they were forced inland a little, now that the night was coming. He had 4 companions, a middle-aged man, Arnie the eagle-eyed, and his adolescent son, a young widow, and the widow's stepson, a lad of 12, and large for his age. The young man, Arneson, called out to the group, "Come see, I found a grotto, a place out of the wind." And Thorsten responded, "Come in, Arneson. Nothing over this way but rocks and ice." The young stalwart had indeed found a grotto, an opening in a rock face that led northward towards the ice cap. "Ah, wonderful! Shelter and, if it's deep enough, perhaps water." He smiled to encourage the other members of the party. After they rested for the night, they breakfasted on the trail rations and warmed themselves at a small turf fire. "We've been at this for most of a week, with no signs of life. I think that if we find no one else living, we should turn back to Hvalsey at midday," Thorsten offered to the general approbation. They set out once more, paralleling the ice sheet that glistened in the near distance. This part of Grönland was more desolate than any other they had seen, barren of both humans and beasts. As the sun approached zenith, they halted in a gaggle. "Are we ready for home?" Thorsten inquired. The smiles and nods were as enthusiastic as the tired countenances could manage. They turned south to explore back along the coast as closely as they dared. Shortly, Arnie the eagle-eyed spied moving figures in their new path. "Thorsten, I see a group of people crossing that small rise to the south. They are coming inland from the coast, maybe a dozen or more. I can't tell what they are at this distance, but they are beyond the steadyings of any of our known eastern colonists. Likely they are Skrellings." And Thorsten grunted acknowledgement. No one could see better than Arnie, unless it was his son, Arnie Arneson, who confirmed his father's suspicions. "I agree, father. They move in a direct line and the smaller ones remain in the middle. Perhaps a family, 2 of them migrating or a warband on the prowl." They awaited the approaching family group. Each party greeted the other to ensure that the other knew that they had no ill intentions. The Skrellings were clearly a family group on the move, since they each carried large burdens, except for the few men at the front and back of the column who carried spears. Thorsten and Arnie each spoke some of the dialect of the strangers that they'd learned from trading and from captured slaves. The Skrellings knew some of the Norse that was the most common tongue among the original settlers for the same reasons. "You come from the sea, but we thought that your people inhabited the ice shelf." Thorsten greeted them without preliminaries. While neither party wanted to engage in hostilities, neither had any interest in passing time with pleasantries. The lead male, clearly the eldest among those whose faces were clearly visible, responded, "Yes, our people now settle where yours have fled. Now we are returning to the lands that we know. The Great Water, it is haunted, an unfriendly place." Thorsten nodded in agreement as much as understanding. "We too have suffered in the Great Water. Now most of us have left for our old lands, as you do now. There is a safe grotto for camping, about half a day's march on our back trail." The stoic-looking Inuit grunted acknowledgement and thanks. "We left the frozen shelf some months ago because it trembled and shook, when in some places it broke. Our clan was much larger in those days, but many died on the trembling ice." His eyes went distant for a moment, filled with tragic memories of traumatic times. "We thought that the land near the big water would be safer, but it is not, and many more died. We are all that is left of our clan. We will not return all the way to the ice shelf until we are far from the Great Water. Something evil and very large now lives under the waves and under the ice nearest to them." And Thorsten nodded. "We call it the Kraken, an old enemy. We have looked for any of our people to let them know that we are leaving Grönland. Our descendants may one day return, but we are finished, and too many have perished with no purpose. You are right. The land has turned sour and evil. Our ancestors would not know it's for the place they chose to settle. I wish your family safe travels and thank you for the knowledge of the trembling ice. Some of our people wish to try living there, but this knowledge, it will help dissuade them." Each party then returned to its own journey, and the Skrellings were soon lost to the distance, even for Arnie's. The elder of them spoke as the party trudged back towards the home. "They are very unrepossessing folk, yet I would not wish such travails on any person. I, for one, will be happy to escape this cursed land. We will remain in Iceland, only long enough to work and make a little money, Then we are bound for Norway. We had once considered settling in the islands north of Scotland, but I for one will never again settle near the sea or on an island in the midst of it. We may even move south into the Germanies. That afternoon the sky turned dark above the distant northern Atlantic. A strong squall approached and the wind refreshed from the direction of the coast. The party deliberately turned inland and soon they were driven naturally northward by the wind and whipping sheets of rain. They sought shelter along the wall of land where it rose to support the eternal ice above. Thorsten sought and found a crevasse similar to the one that had saved him after his experience with the Kraken, though the ground around it was softer and less bleak than the one on the coast had been. "Come, we will shelter here. We will have no fire, but we will escape this hellish wind." The opening in the ground was wider than the one near Hvalsey. The roof was open for only a short way, which worked well, since the downpour from the storm easily penetrated from the top of the temporary home. There was no fire nor light available, yet they'd soon groped their way into a space that was beyond the torrent of water that deluged the front part of the split and tortured earth. Some light still managed to seep through the wide gap above, and once their eyes adjusted, they could see well enough. Each huddled against the next for warmth as the day waned towards evening. Thorsten awaked from a dream of skittering, chittering insect sounds. He heard a scuffling in the deep dark recesses of the cave, and his mind immediately took him to the horror of the insect pit. Yet he quickly realized that these sounds in the waking world possessed a different quality. Someone or something was moving in the cave behind the group. He counted the lumps of sleeping bodies beside him. The boy, Snorri, was no longer at his stepmother's side. Thorsten arose and called quietly so as not to disturb the others. "Snorri, where have you gone?" From the inky blackness, Snorri's cracked voice responded. "I am here, Thorsten. I could not sleep. I kept hearing noises from the back of the cave, and so I went to check." As he spoke, the boy's voice grew in volume, and the sounds of his approaching footsteps apprised Thorsten that he had walked back from a considerable distance. "Stay with the group. If you must wander, go out to the front. I know it's cold and wet there, but the caverns in the rock face are a dangerous place. It is easy to get lost inside of them, and there are other dangers." He trailed off, since he did not want to frighten the boy. Thorsten kept his voice calm. He understood the restlessness and energy of youth. "Get some rest and we will be home before you know it. Then we'll all make us a great voyage. We used to go trading, but walrus ivory is no longer in demand. Traders no longer come our way at all. There is nothing to trade and no prospects in our land, but merest survival. The voyage will be a great adventure, like the Vikings, the wayfarers of old. I plan to take my bride to Iceland and see what opportunities lie at the former edge of the world." Snorri nodded, though Thorsten could not clearly see it. "Yes, I am excited. I am a little scared of the Kraken, but of nothing else. Father Nudd says that there is nothing to fear from the Kraken. It is a demon of the deep, but that with proper and fervent prayers, we will be able to pass it and make our way back to safer, more Christian lands." The boy paused. "I am not so sure that I believe the priest. Maybe the old gods are dead, or like the priest claims, never existed. Yet I believe that they lived, and the monsters they fought still live. And so maybe they are still with us, just standing back in the shadows while the priests and their god rail and rant and speak mostly of Satan." Thorsten smiled. He had similar thoughts, especially of late. The two talked for a short time, and presently, as the gaps in their conversation increased, he heard the quiet snores of the boy, whose vast energy had deserted him in the sudden need for sleep, so common in youth. When the light again penetrated their provisional layer, it was not from the opening above, but from the opening of the tunnel behind them. And due to the contrast with the pitch darkness, the dim, pulsating glow was more noticeable and effective than it might have otherwise been. It approached the numerous claws clattered across the surface of the rocky floor. Arneson was first to detect the approaching throng. He arose and looked back towards the oncoming lights, many small lights that worked together. Like an army of fireflies, he thought sleepily. As they advanced, he saw that the lights were low to the ground and bobbed as if on thin stalks, which indeed they were. He soon realized that the lights belonged to and were generated by a living mass of tremendous insects, like large, oblong platters with many legs and protruding stalks, each sporting a small, glowing orb. "Get up! They are coming!" he shouted to rouse his party. He had already risen and was backing towards the small waterfall that had developed from the rainwater flowing into the front of the crevasse from the higher elevations above the opening. His father was next to awaken, then Thorsten. The woman, Bodil, sat up sharply, feeling at the space next to her, and then she leapt to her feet and called to her stepson. "Snorri, where are you, son?" And with the exception of Bodil, the entire party was soon alerted, standing and backing towards the thin waterfall. She stood facing the array of lights, still calling to her stepson. "Snorri, are you there? Answer me!" Thorsten stepped forward to take a hold of her arm and pulled her back from the approaching swarm, but she shook off his grip and strode towards the now slowing insects. "Snorri, where are you?" she shouted plaintively. And from deep within the cavern came an answering cry, faint with distance, a mere echo from the depths. "Help me, Bodil! They're all around me! The spiders! They're coming!" The cries arose to shrieks of fear and agony, and then faded. The army of light came to a halt several feet back from the humans who had invaded the forecourt of their subterranean castle. Bodil sobbed in hopelessness, and Thorsten patted her shoulder and assured her. "We will get him back. He was wandering into the tunnels. He is afraid of strange creatures, but we will find him." And he noted that his voice quavered. He was terrified and held out no real hopes for the boy's well-being. He took the hand axe and sea axe from his belt and approached the skittering swarm that had halted just shy of the sleeping rolls the humans had so recently abandoned, antennae extended to explore the still warm blankets and accoutrements. And Thorsten sheathed his sea axe, strode forward, and snatched up his stout walking staff that included a sharp iron tip. He prodded at the closest of the curious Eurypterids, and they retreated from the still tip of the walking stick. They fouled their fellows, and the entire mass quivered as individual members adjusted to the movements of those in front and shifted to once again find solid footing. Thorsten noted that a stream of creatures had begun to approach around the verges of the main body along the walls. They were unable to cling to vertical surfaces, as would smaller insects, yet they found enough purchase that they were able to approach along a different path than those halted by the strange sensations caused by human presence. Thorsten batted at these intemperate explorers, and soon found that Arnie and Arneson were at either side, and that each employed the harpoons they had carried with them for protection. Bodil soon joined the group and flailed about with her walking staff. The insectoids, in confusion at the physical resistance and taking some damage, turned and fled back to the depths from which they had come. They left behind the still bodies of their dead and the twitching forms of many injured individuals. "Come!" Thorsten shouted and followed them. He wanted to save the boy, if there was any hope, at least from being devoured by these hideous denizens of the underworld. "We can use their lights to follow them." And for all that horde had approached slowly, they apparently possessed the ability to move quickly when necessary, and they now fled the footfalls of the humans in earnest. They were soon far enough ahead of their more cautious pursuers. The tunnel sloped steeply downward and then levelled off into a slow descent. The bobbing light soon faded into a pulsing glow, and darkness encroached. But only briefly did the party stumble along, clutching at the walls and shuffling forward carefully to avoid any pitfalls. Soon a steady glow emanated from the walls and the ceiling. Smaller insects clung there, each with its own orange fire-like orb, and fungi grew that produced a bluish glow. The party was soon making good time until they came to a fork in the tunnel. One branch plunged downward and the other remained mostly level. There was no indication which way the chidden armoured swarm had gone, and Thorsten suggested that they remain on the level pathway. He recalled the cavern with the varied horde of monstrosities at its deep base. Arnie offered that he and his son would take the low road, but Thorsten soon had him convinced that they had best remain together. Bodil had until then remained silent and intent on finding Snorri. She now called out to him and heard her own voice echo, as had his. And there was no response, only a repeated and soon lost repetition of "Snorri!" They proceeded along the more level pathway until shortly from up ahead, a more intense glow began to emerge from a space ahead. "I think it may be a cavern, maybe like the one I found closer to home," Thorsten admonished his companions. "Keep your weapons handy." He followed his own advice and once again took axe and walking staff in hand and loosened his short-sword, slash-long knife in its scabbard. The opening with its well of light was indeed a cavern. The floor was dry and sloped down towards one side, yet there was no dramatic drop as with the first inner earth space Thorsten had encountered. The light suffused the entire area as the glowing fungi expanded and covered the walls but did not grow near the ceiling. The ceiling appeared to have a smoky quality, white like the burning damp wood. Thorsten soon realized that it was the bottom side of the great ice shelf that covered so much of Grönland. Bodil shrieked, "Snorri!" and then choked off sobs as she covered her eyes with her hands. Thorsten saw that where the floor sloped to its lowest level, there was a hole in the floor of the cavern. Above the hole dangled the lifeless corpse of the boy Snorri, hanging from a thick white strand. His head hung downward over the hole, his eyes open, dry and bulging, and his acne-plagued face flushed dark with blood that had drained from the rest of his body. Thorsten took a few steps towards the boy but halted and immediately retreated. Bodil's horrified wail had brought the authors of the boy's demise. Huge spiders boiled from the hole in the floor and swarmed towards the 4 remaining live humans. There was no time to flee, only to fight the swarm of venomous arachnids as they poured into the cavern. The humans employed the weapons they had and did their best to kick and stomp at the creatures with their heavy bodies and long, thin, spiky legs. They were pressed backwards into the tunnel and fought a desperate rear-guard action. Once in the tunnel, the spiders began to climb the walls and drop from above. One entangled in Bodil's hair, which had become loosened during the activities of the night and day. She screamed and flailed at it, but Arneson was quick and accurate with his harpoon. He speared the fat body and flung it aside without grazing Bodil's head. They soon noticed that the press of the Arachnian warriors slowed, the further they drew away from the cavern and down the tunnel. Eventually, they were able to disengage and flee back the way they had come, and they ran until they reached the fork and then stopped, gasping and inhaling heavy breaths. Arnie the eagle-eyed spoke first. He sounded strained and sagged against the wall. "Thorsten, did you see the roof of the cave? It was ice. We've been under the ice sheet for some time. The cavern was actually a pit in the earth with a roof of ice. I should have been filled with ice, but the air from that hole, it was warm." He slumped onto the floor, gasping with effort and pain. "Father!" Arneson called and knelt beside the older man. What is wrong? Arnie smiled grimly at his youngest child. I believe I am dying, son. I received more than one bite from those things. Their venom, it is strong. He coughed and choked for a moment. You must all flee Grönland. He gagged for a moment. The land is cursed and the ice covers dark secrets. His body seized in paroxysm, and then his head lolled to one side, and his breath rattled from his throat. Arneson clutched at him and whispered words of grief into the bluish glow that surrounded them. Thorsten wished to give the boy a moment to grieve, but sounds from the opening of the tunnel aroused his attention. Something large and armored approached from the darkness where the party had slept. There may have been more than one creature, but it was not the same sound of the initial swarm. It seemed to come from something or some things that were bigger. Perhaps there were other apertures that they had missed in the dim light cast by the insects and fungi. Come, we must take the plunging way. Bodil looked at him and then at Arneson, and finally at the corpse of Arnie, the eagle-eyed. She trembled and appeared to be on the verge of panic, but Arneson seized her wrist. Let's go, Bodil. I know you have been shot and hurt, as have I, but we must survive to warn our people. And with that, he tugged her along and they fled down the steep tunnel that they had avoided earlier. The growth on the walls was not as abundant, especially on the lower reaches, and the little lightning bugs were absent altogether. And so the way was dim, though not unlit. They moved as rapidly as good sense allowed. They must still be aware of splits in the tunnel and of cracks and debris on the floor. And presently the sounds of pursuit came to them. There was no rush of hard, sharp appendages, simply the steady tread of many feet, clattering and clicking and grating on both stone and eardrums. We must increase our pace, Thorsten encouraged his remaining comrades. The tunnel widened and they entered a cave that offered a dozen more egresses, all of them plunging downward and with varying degrees of luminescence at the far terminus of most. They looked around in consternation and indecision, and finally Thorsten approached the opening that was nearest to being directly across from the passage they had exited. This way, their leader called, and once more they plunged deeper into the solid earth. The tunnel proved to be small, and the ceiling lowered in places so that they had to stoop to avoid striking their heads on the inflexible surface. The heavy skittering of whatever followed them echoed down the passageway. The light ahead of them intensified, and Thorsten feared that they were about to enter the lair of the spiders, since the upcoming chamber had to have been nearly below the pit in the ice-roof cavern, though it was hard to tell with the turns and twists of the tunnel and with no open sky to guide them. He heard a new sound from the open space, the sloshing and splashing of water. They emerged into a vast space and found themselves on the shore of an inland lake or sea. There was a brackish odour to the stale air that hinted at the latter. There was a accompanying foul stench that clouded the space, like that one finds at the ebb tide. Trapped! The word likely sounded in the minds of his companions as well, though neither spoke a word. There was room to move laterally along the walls in either direction, while remaining on the beach of black gravel. Thorsten cast looks towards both available pathways, then turned away from where he thought that the spider cave resided. The others followed without protest, and they jogged along the shoreline, each of them nearing exhaustion. He chanced to look back at the tunnel from which they'd recently fled, and his breath caught as he observed several long, thick, sinuous figures, each with numerous legs that supported bodies with overlapping plates of chitin debouch onto the beach. Antennae twitched and black, soulless eyes glittered as they rotated in search of prey. Once again, the monsters, each around 8 feet in length, set out, undulating along the trail of the intrepid trio of Grönlanders. Thorsten knew that they were getting to a point at which they would have to flee, and fall, or stand and fight, and he called a halt. "We are all too tired to keep running. There are only 4 of them. Let us fight. If we can crush their heads, their bodies will die, and we will be able to stop and rest for a moment." And he looked into the 2 panting, flushed faces of the young people, and both nodded in agreement. He noted that Bodil had exchanged her walking stick for Arnie's harpoon at some point during their brief sojourn at the fork in the tunnels. He grimaced and nodded in approval as he set his mind to the new task at hand. The enormous centipedes had nearly caught up to them with their steady, untiring pace. One was in the lead and stopped as Thorsten stepped forward, using the iron tip of his walking staff like a short spear. Yet, as he struck, the target moved swiftly, and the sharp tip of his weapon struck only gravel and dirt. The centipede had raised the upper third of its body from the ground and issued a high-pitched screeching hiss that grated on the senses of each of the humans who faced it. Thorsten stepped forward and buried his axe between the obsidian orbs and twitching antennae. By then, 2 of the creatures had approached and engaged his companions. They had learned from watching Thorsten's encounter how to get the monsters to raise up and become targets, and 2 more of the creatures joined the first in twitching death spasms. The 4th and final, the largest at nearly 10 feet long, rose and struck towards Thorsten's chest. The heavy impact knocked him onto his back and left him at the mercy of the beast. He had not felt the burning sting that he expected when the thing hit him. There had been no teeth to sink into his flesh, but now its tremendous weight crushed him to the floor, as its many claws pierced him through his thick, layered clothing. The stinking chitin brushed across his face, and he turned away in disgust and fear. "This is it. My bride will now be a widow," he thought in despair. Yet the weight decreased, and the hissing monster soon passed over him and skidded on down the beach. He looked to his companions to see how they had fared, and both still wore terrified expressions. Thorsten then climbed to his feet, sore and mystified as he looked after the retreating form. Maybe they were just going in the same direction. Maybe not everything wishes to eat us. They found some jagged rocks that had fallen from a higher point at some time in the past and perched among them. They would present no serious barrier to oversized insects, yet they provided a sense of comfort to the human psyches that had been sorely tested so recently. They opened their bindles and took out their little food and small containers of water that they had brought. "I want my blanket, though it's not as cold as it should be," Bodil opined. And though they had spent days together, for the first time Thorsten noticed just how young she was. No more than a year or 2 older than Arneson. "I think that the warmth must come from the water, a current that comes in from the ocean, though I have no idea how the water is warmed. I know that Iceland, they have volcanoes that burn and steam in competition with the cold. Perhaps the currents originate from those lands." The young people were apparently too worn from their ordeal to respond coherently, and so Thorsten suggested that they rest and that he would take first watch. He saw that Arneson ensured that Bodil was as comfortable as possible before he settled in beside her, and so that each might share warmth with each other. He smiled to himself. Even here, they cling to life and perhaps love. Bodil is young and will soon heal from her losses. And Arneson is a young man, as much as he is a boy. The thoughts comforted him as he began his long vigil. He soon nodded off and slumped against the back of his rock chair. When he awakened, it was to Arneson tugging at his leg. "Thorsten, I think we should leave. We've seen several more groups of the larger monsters troop by and Many of the ones with little lanterns are on their heads. Are they past their camp?" He shuddered. No spiders, though." They were soon ready to travel once more. "Let's go, back up to the tunnel that we entered," Thorsten suggested. "Now we know that most of the creatures will not harm us if we stay out of their way. It's the shortest route home." The others readily agreed, but soon found that there were many openings that led upwards. They were unsure of which one they had used, that which would lead them to the main tunnel. Arneson suggested that they could follow their own tracks, but they soon discovered that those had been obliterated by the tracks of tiny feet and large dragon bodies. Finally, Thorsten shrugged. "There were lights at the end of most of the passages. It looked like they might all empty out into this room, and many came from a cave at the end of the plunging way." He glanced up at the dark roof overhead, too far for the glow of the fungi to reach. "We need to get back above ground and make our way home. We are low on food, and who knows how much time has passed, where Suna still casts her light." He found that more and more he had turned to the old gods for comfort, as the recent trials had shown in him that they perhaps were better equipped to face such eldritch challenges than the Prince of Peace. He would have to be careful when they reached Iceland. If his alteration in beliefs came to light, the local church might prosecute him for it, and the penalties for apostasy, or they were steep. "I'd be better off dying here and now," he thought bitterly. He peered into an opening that he thought looked familiar. "Do you think it was this one? It goes pretty straight and slopes upward." When the young couple looked and agreed that it must be the way they had come from before. They climbed for a distance, perhaps not so far as they had descended, and then the shaft took a sharp turn, one that had not been present in the first passage. It curved away and perhaps paralleled the shoreline they had departed. They determined that they should continue. None felt like descending and climbing into another passageway that might lead into yet another false direction. Soon, their suspicions were proved when the tunnel opened onto a rocky shelf above the water. They took seats along the ledge, feet dangling down towards the relatively calm waters below, and rested for a moment to collect their thoughts. "It's not all ugly," Arneson offered. "The light is pretty in a way, and the sea, while it smells stale and thick, it's pleasant enough. I hate it all. Everything here is ugly, foul, and reeks of death." She choked back a sob. "Poor Snorri." Thorsten was inclined to agree, but kept his thoughts to himself. He looked along the shelf and saw that another portal led upwards from it and in the right direction. He was about to inform the others when the waters below suddenly grew turgid and tremendous waves washed over the rocks along the shoreline. A hideous, bulbous cone emerged from the depths, and tentacles snaked around and reached in various directions, seeking prey. Perhaps, though none could know what passed inside that enormous head. "The Kraken!" Thorsten screamed in his mind, his breath having fled his lungs so that he was unable to shout his consternation. Now the shelf was a good 30 feet above the water, but Thorsten knew the extent of those seeking, grasping appendages. He ushered his 2 charges into the new shaft and turned back to determine whether death would catch him this time. His eyes met a single orb on the hideous countenance that faced him. It blinked its nictitating membrane over the surface to clear its sight, and Thorsten found himself staring into an enormous, hate-filled eye that saw him only as potential prey. Small prey. Immediately, one of the tentacles probed towards his perch on the shelf. He fled into the passage and urged his companions to best their speed. "Run or die! The Kraken has spied us!" And they fled upwards as fast as the occasionally low ceiling permitted. A thundering, wet slap sounded at the entrance to the tunnel behind them. The greater light from the cavern was occluded, and sounds of a tremendous sinuous, slithering appendage pursued them up the tunnel. As tired, hungry, and thirsty as they were, they scrambled and crawled and clawed their way ahead. Thorsten, in the rear, felt something large but soft strike the back of his legs. The force propelled him forward and into the rear of Arneson, who in turn was pushed into Brodil's hindquarters. They all fell forward and were pushed ahead in a pile of humanity for another 20 feet. Then the pressure suddenly ceased. The tip of the tentacle writhed before them, but it did not follow any further up the tunnel. The cloying stench emanated from the appendage, and the smell of dead things from the bottomless depths of the sea. Thorsten laughed hysterically. "Ha ha 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 ha! The arm gets thicker as it nears the body of the creature. The tunnel is too narrow for the tentacle to embrace us. How about we give it a sting?" And with that he stood and drove the tip of his walking stick into the pallid flesh of their tormentor. The shaft plunged all the way into the stinking flesh. The teens soon added their harpoons, each finding that flesh gave easily. The tentacle indeed retreated down the passage, leaving the crushed and fading remnants of their friendly glowing fungi that guided them, but taking the staff and the 2 harpoons. There was still plenty of growth ahead, along with some non-luminous lichens that boded well for the presence of living things, and they resumed their journey along the pathway of light. Soon the tunnel increased in size and they found themselves in yet another crevasse, and this one roofed with ice. As the temperature dropped, the fungi faded and the lichen increased. Lights from above soon penetrated from a clear, cerulean sky. They passed beyond the eternal ice and soon found themselves on rough turf, not far from the sea. They turned west towards home and within a few days arrived, hungry, exhausted, and dirty in Hvalsey. Thorsten was overwhelmed with bliss as he embraced his lovely wife. "Oh, you stink!" she exclaimed. He pulled away in embarrassment, and she quickly caught him up in her arms. "I didn't say let go. I could enjoy your stench after you endured such a journey." They ate as much as they could stand, though they had long been able to stake their thirst, having been supplied with water by the numerous cold springs that flowed from the ice sheet towards the ocean. Each slept in the next day, warm for the first time in days. About mid-afternoon, Thorsten was awakened by shouts outside. He scrambled to his feet, picked up his weapons, and rushed to meet the new horror he assumed would greet him. He was elated to see that the shouts were in greeting for Frode's returning party, now reduced to just the man himself and 1 companion. Each appeared wounded and limped and stumbled until friends seized and supported them, and Thorsten soon found himself in Frode's home, hovering over his sick friend as Frode had watched over him. The wise eyes looked up, haunted by recent horrors, inflicted not by monsters from the deep, but from fellow humans. "We left the western colony and trekked back towards home. The thralls accompanied us, remaining mostly in our wake, as is proper. When we drew near the ice shelf, we had to camp. In the night, the thralls and a band of Skraelings really attacked us. The thralls had been in league with the Skraelings all along and had become as degraded as their new tribe, devourers of human flesh. Gorm and I barely escaped with our lives. We took several of them with us, including one of the white thralls." Thorsten hung his head briefly and quietly informed Frode that he was the lone survivor of the trek. "Gorm died from a fever brought on by infections in his wounds. Our already small band of settlers has been reduced even further." Over the next few days, the sad remnants of the outpost gathered what belongings and provisions they could and boarded the last of their ships. The tiny fleet fled straight to the sea on the ebbing evening tide. they wished to get as far from Grönland as possible in the coming dark before they adjusted their course for Iceland. They took with them the records from the church, but they had held a moot, and all agreed that there would be no mention of the Kraken. Father Nudd assured them that they would do well to put the devil behind them as they sought the deep blue sea. Author's note. Records indicate that Sigrid Bjorndottir and Thorstein Olafsson married at Hvalsey's church. They eventually settled in Iceland around 1424 CE. There are numerous theories why the Greenland colony failed and of what happened to those who left it. Currently, the thinking is that there was a long, slow decline, and only at the end was there an abrupt departure. An observation, my own, and likely specious. The mound cultures in the Americas started to fail around the same time. No clear connection, and they were distant from one another. Just saying. Michael Bear Lockhart. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. This one sailed through the air like a fine arrow from the heart of Viking and Norse mythology. What an incredible addition to your collection of stories, Michael. And thank you ever so much for your dedication and input and general friendship. The last year I think we're coming up to now, if not just over a year, has been an absolute blast. And I truly cannot wait to see what else you manage to conjure up in the future. Well, guys and girls, you know the drill. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, please do get in touch at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a banging week at work or school, studying. I hope the roads have been nice and clear for all your long haul drivers. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and you're keeping fit and focused during these testing times. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.